Could have been me, but that's a different story. But in a similar way, we are polluting our own planet with enormous amounts of waste that are even hard to imagine. And our planet is not capable of dealing with that. And at the same time, every single day, we are physically destroying the only planet we have to live on. Which doesn't really make sense, right? And these are only the ecological principles that we use to destroy our planet. And then there's this whole social element, where we've designed social systems that don't allow for millions and millions of people to actually meet their basic human needs, that live in poverty. There are huge amounts of inequality. And I think, at least that's for me, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing nowadays. And hopefully this is also why you're actually here and why you're sitting here, because this is something you want to address in what way whatsoever. But if our educational system is related to all of these challenges, if you turn it around, to use the words of Nelson Mandela, maybe education is also the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. But that sounds kind of paradoxical, right? Like, can something be one of the main causes of creating something, and at the same time be the most powerful solution to solve that? Like, that seems to be a paradox. And to understand how that paradox works, we need to look at another brilliant mind that walked this planet. Because Albert Einstein taught us that we cannot solve our problems with the same way of thinking we used when we created them. So again, just to repeat that, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So that might be the reason why it's such a paradox and we haven't been able to solve that. And in other words, what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to design all of these new apps to solve our problems, but what we might need is a completely new operating system. But in order to understand what that means, we need to know what that way of thinking is that we used when we created all of these problems. Okay? So, in order to do that, we're going to travel in time a little bit. And I want to play a little game, Who Am I? So, question for you, who knows who this is? Yes. And what was he famous for?
His laws of gravity.
Laws of gravity, yes. Anything else?
Standing on Titan's shoulders.
Sorry?
I'm standing on Titan's or Atlan's shoulders.
Ah, yes, that's a really nice quote, right? I love that one as well. True, Isaac Newton, definitely famous for laws of gravity, basic mechanisms. But one thing that he also taught was around systems. And his way of looking at systems was that you could analyze them by breaking them into smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And by analyzing those smaller parts, understanding the bigger system. It's a lot of how our scientific way of looking at the world was created, by analyzing smaller and smaller parts and see how those influence each other, and that creates the bigger system. Alright, another one. Who knows who this is? It's a little bit more difficult. Say that again?
Philosopher.
Yes, Francis Bacon. What was he famous for? He also brought the scientific method further, and what he did, he separated man from nature. So one of the things that he did was talking about how man should dominate nature, like how we own nature. It's another thing that has been ingrained in our minds, is that we as humans are separated from nature. And then the final one?
Descartes.
Descartes. Nice. What do you study?
Management of the creative arts.
Yes, René Descartes. What was he famous for?
Well, plenty of things actually, maths and philosophy, and his famous poem about
Do it.
the existence. Oh, I don't remember the Latin, but
Cogito ergo sum, so I think, therefore I know. So a lot of what he talked about was cause and effect. If this happens, then that happens. And that's also a really dominant way that we've started looking at the world, that there's a linear relationship between cause and effect. if we understand how this works and analyze that, we know that this will happen. So this was the 17th century. These were some of our most brilliant minds, and they really strongly influenced the way we look at the world. And we started to see the world as a clockwork, as a machine. If we understand how this little thing turns, we know that this one will work in that way, and this one work in that way, and so on and so on. That's a lot of how we actually started to look at the world, which was strongly reinforced by the Industrial Revolution. Because of all the technological information through machinery, our way of looking through the world as a machine grew stronger and stronger. We started to separate everything into smaller processes. If you look at these people, they're only doing their small part, right? It's like building a car and everybody does their tiny little thing, and we break everything down in little systems, and together that creates the bigger picture. Then there was this man, Frederick Winslow Taylor, and he really developed that idea. What he did, he went into all of these machines with a, and I've been thinking about this word and I don't know the word in English. What's the word you, yes, a roller, to see like, hey, what are the distances? So what he did, he looked at every single step of every process and he measured it and he analyzed it. And based on all of his calculations, he was able to make everything as effective as possible. And again, that's a lot of what we see in our world and in our organizations, right? Like we analyze and we look what is the most effective way to do it if we break it all down in smaller parts. And that's what we do nowadays in all of our work, in all of our organizations. We analyze, we gather data, we plan. Planning is one of the things we love the most. Everybody good at planning, the planners are the best. We analyze and get as much data as possible, and that's how we predict the future. And this is like, who doesn't recognize these things? Interesting. This seems pretty familiar, right? This is how a lot of our processes in society work, whether that's management, like creating planning, year planning, 5-year planning. This is a lot of the way we look at the world. We expect the world to be predictable and that there's a linear relationship between cause and effect. Again, if we do this, then this happens. As long as we analyze this piece of the system, we know that this will be the effector. My question is that actually the way our world works? Let's do some more traveling and we go back to our current reality. And let's look at one of the most fundamental challenges that we're facing as a species right now, climate change. And then you have to imagine that this is a planetary scale, where all the natural systems are at stake and are influencing each other. And at the same time, who knows how many people were alive during, let's say, when Newton was alive in 1600?
1 billion plus half a billion.
That's right, around 500 million people, 1600. Then, in the times of Frederick Winslow Taylor, late 1800s, early 1900s.
2 billion.
A little bit less. About 1.2 billion. So from 1600 till 1900, in 300 years time, it kind of doubled. So from like 500 million to 1.2 billion. It's 2018 right now. So since 1900 till 2018, in 118 years, how many people do we have living on this planet right now? Rounded about 7 billion. So in order to address this thing we call climate change, we have to account for all the natural systems that we have, and we have to deal with 7 billion people and counting, right? Because it is expected to go up till at least, I think, 10 or 11 billion in the next 20 to 30 years. So how predictable And how linear would that relation between cause and effect be? Maybe you're understanding where I'm going to, but let's play the game. In December 2015, most people know what this was, right? The legendary Paris Climate Agreement. After, I think, more than 20 years of trying to negotiate an agreement between all the countries in the world almost, at the end of 2015, the historical thing happened. 195 countries signed an agreement that together they would address climate change. It was huge, and you could feel it in the world. Everywhere in the world, there was this feeling like, this is the moment, this is change. Change is going to happen. In the Netherlands, I'm originally from the Netherlands, the parliament voted to close down the coal industry. In Norway, people were thinking about banning gas-burning cars. In France, they banned plastic. Even the Olympics, the opening ceremony had a climate change theme. I couldn't be happier. And well, my other origins from Indonesia, even there they were trying to address it. So change was in the air and everybody was excited. And then this happened. Donald Trump got elected as president of the United States. Nobody had expected that. With all the data and all the analyzing, I think the day before the actual elections, it was 70% Hillary Clinton, 30% Donald Trump. Nobody had expected that. And it completely changed the whole game. Because then people got anxious and thought it was a disaster for the planet. Major US companies, cities, states tried to address him to not ditch the climate change denial, but at the end, they decided to back out of the climate agreement. At the same time, something else happened. China stepped up and started to invest billions and billions and billions of euros or dollars. And they're starting to become leaders in terms of addressing climate change. And at the same time, the IPCC report just came out and told us that we only have a 12-year window. California is on fire in the United States at the moment. Nobody had expected this and nobody saw this coming. With all the data in the world, nobody could have predicted this. Could it be that our world is more unpredictable and more complex than we thought? Let's look at another example. Who knows who this is? Yes. This is Tariq Bouazizi. At the late, I think it was 2010, he's a street vendor, 26-year-old, in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. And he is really unsatisfied with his life conditions. He's being bullied by the local government, the local police. They closed his store and they confiscated all of his possessions in his store. The only thing he could do, according to himself, was protest and set himself on fire. Unfortunately, Tariq passed away 5 days later. In the time of Newton, Francis Bacon, Frederick Winslow Taylor, this could have happened as well. And that news might have traveled to some neighboring villages, cities, and that was it. But the time that we live in now is completely different. Because what happened is that his actions were filmed on camera and were put on social media instantly, and the video went completely viral, which sparked some of the biggest protests in Tunisia. And at the end of these protests in Tunisia, the reigning president of Tunisia signed down after 23 years of being in power. That then inspired many countries in the Arab region to do the same, which triggered the Arab Revolution. The single action of Tariq created a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. People could have analyzed data and data and data and data, but because our world is more complex and more interconnected, it's impossible to predict these outcomes. One more example. 15 October 2017, this tweet was placed by Alyssa Milano, a famous actress. This was one of the, I think, many millions of tweets that get placed every day. But this one had something special, because this created a movement of change called Me Too, which created a whole chain of events, again, that nobody could have predicted. And what we're seeing now is that this tweet actually creates a movement that helps us reimagine the issues that we have in our societies in terms of masculinity and femininity. Again, a single action that creates a way bigger change that nobody in the world with any type of data or any type of analysis could have predicted. So, now what does that mean? That means that we need to change the way we actually look at the world. We need to have a different operating system to look at the world. We need to move away from looking at the world as a machine or as a clockwork, to see the world as a living system that it is. And that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. I won't go into all of the details of what it means to look at living systems, or the scientific term, a complex adaptive system, but there are a couple of things that I want to highlight to hopefully help you understand what that means. First of all, it's this notion of things being interconnected with each other. Instead of looking at a system that you can break down in smaller and smaller and smaller parts, and then you can say, like, if this one happens, then that one happens, and then that one happens. So a linear relationship between cause and effect. It's acknowledging that many different things in the system are interconnected with each other, and they all interact with each other and with their environment. As an example, instead of looking at an organization from this perspective, who has worked in an organization that has something like this? It's less than I had expected. Like, well, there's more, I can see it.
And most of the organizations are like this.
Most of the
It's
organizations.
not startups or.
Right? Okay, so looking at a system as a living system is acknowledging that the world doesn't work like this, where everything is separated, where there is no interaction between these, and information travels in straight lines. Into seeing an organization like this, which might be more realistic, because everything is interconnected. Like, there are so many different types of relations between people and their environment that influence the whole system. Everything is interconnected and everybody interacts with each other. That's one part. Then there's something called emergence. So instead of taking the Newtonian perspective of thinking that a system is just the sum of its parts, the sum or the whole is actually more than the sum of its parts. If you look at, I think, one of the most fascinating species that are alive on our planet, ants, and the way they collaborate together, one single ant could never ever cross the other side. But together, they become more than the sum of their parts. Because together, they become something bigger that no individual entity in any system could become. A different example, who knows who these guys are? Yes, one football fan. This is Leicester City, and in the 2015-2016 season, they did something that was almost seen as impossible. They are, let's say, one of the shittiest teams in the Premier League. I think at the beginning of the season, they were expected to relegate, and their coach was supposed to be the first one who got sacked. And as the season progressed, they kept winning and kept winning and kept winning. After the first month, people thought like, this is the luck of the beginning team. This will go away. And 2 months passed, 3 months passed, and it was like, no, it'll even out. Then 4, 5, 6. And it's like, what? No, this is not going to happen. 7 weeks. At the end of the season, they did something that was Yeah, like I said, almost impossible. They won the league. Individually, all of these players are less football players than many of the players in Manchester United, Manchester City, Chelsea, all the big teams with way more money. But there was something happening inside of that team that made it more than just the sum of their parts. So if you put a living system together, there is something new that can emerge out of that, which is more than the sum of its parts. So that's another important characteristic of living systems. And then finally, adaptation. And there are way more, but these were the ones that I wanted to highlight. And adaptation means that elements in a system can change based on their interactions with one another, with the environment, and patterns of behavior can change over time. Has anybody ever seen a little video called How Wolves Change Rivers? I wish I could. For time reasons, I'm not showing it. I can highly recommend to watch it. What happened in the Yellowstone Park in the United States? They reintroduced wolves again. And what happened was that it completely changed the ecosystem because wolves started to hunt the bigger animals that would be eating the grass like on the river's edge. And by reintroducing the wolf, it changed the ecosystem in such a way that the whole way of the rivers started to change. So after 10 years, a river that went like this first, now went all the other way around. So what happens with living systems is that they adapt and they can change over time. So that's again a fundamentally different way of looking at systems and how systems change actually happens. Are you still with me? Okay, good. One way of looking at it that really helps in understanding what type of challenges are that we're facing is something called the Cynefin framework. I think it's a Welsh word. It's a framework coined by Dave Snowden. He is a really smart complexity and systems thinker. And this framework really helps you to understand in what kind of situations we are. So, first of all, there's the simple domain. And you can see that as starting the car. It's a really simple, linear cause and effect relationship. If I turn the lock, the car starts. Every time I do this, the car starts. It's linear, it's obvious to all, and there is a best practice, so there is a best way of doing it. That's the simple domain. Then there's the complicated domain. This is mainly the domain of Newton, Bacon, Frederick Winslow Taylor. And you can compare that with building a car. It's more complicated, but there is still a linear relationship between cause and effect. Even though it goes a little bit there and there and there, you could still say, if I do all of this in the right way, eventually you can build a car. I think even I could do it, even though I have two left hands, but there is a logic into that. So in this case, cause and effect, they require analysis for expert knowledge, but there is still a relationship between cause and effect. And there's a good practice. There are multiple ways of doing it, but there is still a good practice. But then we go into the complex domain, and the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of the challenges that we're facing are actually in the complex domain, but we treat them as if they are complicated. And in the complex realm, cause and effect only make sense in hindsight. And there's emergent behavior in the system. So you can compare that to driving your car in heavy traffic. So if you would enter this roundabout with your car, the only thing you know is that you need to get here at the end. How you will get there, you cannot predict. Because there's emergent behavior, all the cars are working together, and every time you will enter that, you will have a different route. You will never ever have the same way of doing that, because there is constant interaction between all the elements in the system. So there's connectivity, there is a non-linearity, which means that any small type of change can create an extremely different outcome. So if one car like stops and turns around, everything will be completely different. There's a high information threshold, so there's lots of information going on. People are reacting to each other. It's adaptive, and there's emergence. This is a lot of the challenges that we're facing are complex. And then there's another piece, which is called the chaotic domain, and you can compare it to having an accident, where you have to act instantly without even thinking about cause and effect, and there is not necessarily a cause and effect at play. So this is a really helpful framework to actually realize and recognize what types of challenges are we facing. I'm not trying to say that this is not valuable. The point I'm trying to make is that you need to recognize what type of challenges you're facing, and the way you address them differs in terms of complicated, complex, simple, and chaotic. So, to use the words of Donella Meadows, a brilliant systems thinker, the world is an interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, and economic system. But we treat it as if it were not. As if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from that mismatch. So, why is all of this relevant when it comes to education for sustainable development? Because that's why I was asked to come here, and I hope that's also why you are interested in being here. If not, then thanks for coming. But the question is, why is all of this whole story relevant to education and learning about sustainable development? Because we're still educating for the machine age. We are still educating people to find the right answer and to think in cause and effect. And it's all really linear. When I arrived here, all the chairs were like this, and the first thing I did was, okay, I need to create a little bit more of a circle, because this is how we educate our people. And we try to analyze, we have loads of data on how children should perform, we test them, we rank them, we create a plan, we channel our inner Frederick Winslow Taylor when we look at education. And you might say it's unfair because this picture was taken in 1850, I think. So it might be unfair of me to use a picture that was taken in 1850. But nothing has changed. This is still the way most of our educational institutes look like. And we've separated all of the knowledge. This is math, this is geography, this is biology, economics, but there's no bigger interaction between that. And we rank people on this piece, and on that piece, and on that piece. And we're still educating people as if we're living in Newtonian times. Nothing really changed. Not in elementary school, not in high school, not in universities. There's still one person in front of the room transferring knowledge, telling them how it works, what the right answer is, and people need to reproduce that. So, my question becomes, what if our current educational system is not designed to help us solve the challenges that we're facing? What if the main reason why we're facing all of these challenges is actually because our educational system is still designed for the machine age and for Newtonian times? That's really easy, right? Like, I can analyze and see, like, yes, this is what's wrong. But then the main question is, what do we need to do differently? How can we change our educational system? And what does it mean to see the world as a living system when we talk about education? As you see, I like traveling. We won't travel in time. But we will go to Karlskrona in Sweden, because this is where I work. And these are some of the lessons that I've learned and I'd love to share with you. And I'd love to afterwards have a conversation around that. This is not the truth, but I do strongly believe that this type of education is what is needed to start facing these challenges that we're facing. So, the first lesson that I've learned is that we need to move away from focusing on separate parts, but we actually need to help people see the whole system. Because what we often see in the world is that we focus on this small part and we design a solution for something, and then there's like many unintended consequences that create an outcome that nobody wants. Because everybody just focuses on their smaller system. One pretty famous illustration to show that is this one. It's about the blind man don't knowing what they see. This guy thinks this is a snake. This person thinks it's a magic rug. This person thinks it's a weapon. This person thinks it's a tree. This person thinks it's a wall. And this person thinks it's a road. And this is what we often see in the way we work, in the way we educate. We only look at our smaller system, and nobody can see the bigger picture. So what we need to do is to help people zoom out and see the whole system, and actually invite the whole system in the room to have a conversation around that. Because that's the only way how we can start addressing these issues. So that was one. Another one is that I think we should move from looking for better answers to actually start asking better questions. Because when you acknowledge that all of these challenges are inherently complex, there are no simple answers. There is no simple answer to climate change, poverty, inequality. If there were, we would have figured it out already. We wouldn't be sitting here in this room. If there was a simple answer, we could have come up with it. But there's not. We've been trying for many years and invented loads and loads of policies. If you look at unemployment, for example, every country struggles with unemployment, and what we often do is design a policy. This is the answer, and then unemployment will drop with 4.3%. That never happens. I've never seen that word. So what we need to do is we need to learn how to ask better questions. Because better questions help us open up and look at things from a different perspective. Einstein once said, if I had 1 hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes on trying to find the right question. So the idea is that we need to learn how to ask better questions instead of looking for answers all the time. Then we need to shift from competing to collaborating. A lot of the way our system is designed, it's focused on competition. Because the one that gets the best grades will go to the best university, will go get the best job, and earn the most money. And that's often how we look. We grade people individually, and this person scores the highest, and on and on and on and on. But unfortunately, in all of these complex challenges, nobody's going to solve that by him or herself. Or at least that's what I think. Has anybody of you figured out the answer to climate change? Good. Nobody will do that by him or herself. And the only way we can start addressing it is to start working together in a different way and start focusing more on collaborating. A different way of looking at it is that we need to move from individual brilliance to collective intelligence. If we understand that nobody will figure out the answer to any type of complex challenge by him or herself, we need to start thinking about how can we actually create the conditions for collective intelligence to be in the room. Because all of these people here in the room together will know more than any other individual except. So we need to move away from individual brilliance to actually creating the right conditions for collective intelligence to arise. Another way of looking at it is that we need to move from heroes to hosts. We have a really strong focus on heroes, on the people, our leaders, the movie stars, the sporters, whoever it is, the hero that is going to solve our problems. But again, if nobody can do it by ourselves, we need to look at it in a different way, and we need to start looking at hosts. And hosts in this context means those are the people that create the right conditions for conversations that matter. So they are the ones that create the right conditions for people to work better together. So we need to shift away from this focus on this is the hero to who are the people that can create these conditions. And then finally, we need to leave this notion of teaching and look at what it means to learn together. If there's one lesson that I've learned over the last years, is even though I am a educator, a facilitator, a teacher, a host, whatever you want to call it, I would argue that I've learned more from the people that I've taught, or students, than they learned from me. And there is this notion that we need to leave the person in front of the room is the teacher and will tell you what the right answer is, to actually move the teacher to the middle of the room and start to learn together. So, those are some of my lessons. There's way more, so we can talk more about that later. But what I want to say is that what we're doing in Sweden is not unique. This is happening all over the world. There's people reimagining the future of education everywhere. We just need to make it visible. Everything that we dream of is already here. And that's what makes me hopeful. And actually being in a room like this with people that want to create change is what makes me hopeful. Because I'm often asked, are you optimistic or pessimistic given all of those bigger challenges that we're facing? And my answer to that is always, I'm neither. Because for me, optimism is based on the false premise that everything will be alright in the end, no matter what we do. In the same way that pessimism is based on the false assumption that everything will go to shit at the end, no matter what we do. The problem with that is that it limits us from taking action, because it's already determined. But for me, there's a difference between optimistic and hopeful. And my answer is always, I'm hopeful. Because, and I don't want to use my own words because there's someone else who can do that way better than I do, and that's how I want to end. It's by using the words of Rebecca Solnit. And she says that hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what's going to happen, and that in that spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. Hope is a belief that what we do might matter, and an understanding that the future isn't written yet. Thank you. So what my plan would be is to spend a little bit of time if you have any questions, and then afterwards I would love to play around a little bit in this model and get to know you a little bit better. So, does anybody have any questions? And I think that I need to start using this thing, or unless we want to do it in English. But yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So as I understand, you are working at ETH, right? You are teaching at this program.
Yes, that is true.
I myself working as in Moscow State University, and I'm also teaching sustainability to
Nice.
students.
Cool.
And so it's very interesting. I mean, the idea of having a whole picture, asking better question, collaboration, etc. I'm thinking, how can I apply my current curriculum in my current course?
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of, what you propose, it's very interesting, but it's a bit vague. It's in a way.
Sure.
Yeah, so it would be very interesting to me how to do it more practical scale. And I also want to know your, what would you suggest, because the main challenge for me to teach sustainability to students who are teaching economics, who are teaching more on this management and has a very practical mind. And the main challenge in how to make them interested in these topics, because this is not what they are interested in. They want to have a better life, good job, etc. So.
Alright, to answer your first question, one of the things I want to do is make it more practical. Like, this was more a high-level overview of, I think, some of the underlying fundamentals of why we need to work differently. And what I want to do is, after we take a tiny little 5-minute lecture, to actually work with practical models that actually show how you can work in a different way, also with your students. And I would say there are many different ways of working. I'm also connected to something we call the art of hosting, and it's called the art of hosting conversations that matter. And it works a lot with different methodologies that can actually help you create the conditions for collective intelligence. So Those are instruments like World Cafe, Open Space, Design for Wider Action. There are many, many different ways where you can actually get a group as large as 500 people to work together on a single topic. So I think there's like many ways to do that. And then your second question, I recognize that a lot. And if you look at our master's program, we have 50 students from 28 different countries. And the youngest is 23 and the oldest is 55. And everything that comes in between from all different backgrounds. So everybody has their own interest in either being in Karlskrona, sustainability or not. But if there's one thing that I think I've learned is that it's important to speak their language and to know how, if they are more interested in finding good jobs and having a better life, there's a really strong argument to actually focus on sustainability, because there's a whole business case for sustainability that shows that if you, as an organization, focus on sustainability, you'll be one step ahead of the competition and you'll attract better and more talented skills, because most of the younger generation is more looking for purpose than for money. So there's like really strong arguments to actually focus on like looking at sustainability from a business perspective. So I would say, well, at least what I try to do, and it's like I said, it's not the truth or whatever, but I would always try to speak their language and see how you can find a hook or a connection to that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Anybody else? Yes.
Okay, so what actually do you mean by raising good questions? So could you give an example, or just maybe ask a good question about the problematic of
Sure.
unemployment? Now, what would be the right question to fight the problem of unemployment?
Sure. So I think one of the things around questions is that they need to be challenging and opening, but also not too much, right? So if I would ask you, why did you do this? There's like some kind of accusation in that, right? So that's not often the right question to ask. But one question in terms of unemployment could be to ask a group of people and gather them around the table and ask, and this is a good, like now I need to think out, like, I would say, what do you dare dream is possible if we start working together and address unemployment or whatever skill? So if you have a group of people that are all from different industries and you ask those types of questions, that evokes creativity, that evokes visioning. So there's loads of resources as well about how you can actually craft questions that work well for different groups of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Well, more or less. Actually.
More or less.
On the one hand, yeah, it sounds logical, but on the other hand, I don't really see the difference between just asking this kind of question and just direct address of the problem.
Alright, so I would say there's a difference between saying, what can we do to address unemployment?
Yeah.
Right, that's a really direct question.
Straightforward.
Straightforward.
Yeah.
Or saying, what do you dare dream is possible? How might we, actually there's something around the phrasing that will invite more creativity in a group of people.
Yeah, so just about, yeah, okay.
Yeah? And it's like, I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to put more attention to questions that we ask. Because often everything is focused on answers. But I strongly believe that in working in these types of complex issues, there is more value in actually spending more time on the questions that we ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
So we can have two questions.
Yes, of course.
First one is, as you said, we don't have a lot of time,
Mhm.
and it's probably 12 years until something that happens. Yes, maybe.
Maybe, yes.
And the educational system in Russia, and I think in many countries, is a little big and it's slow to change.
Yep.
So, is supplementary education enough in the way that you're describing to change the way people act, or does it have to be the whole educational system to create the person of the future? This would be the first question.
Yes.
Second, you said about business that sustainability is important for it, and you can think in terms of your future career, that sustainability is a plus. But in Russia, we just had a research on sustainable development goals and how companies are working to accept them.
Yeah.
And actually, it's not really,
Yeah.
that good. So they're really thinking more about the economic side still. So
Yeah.
again, not a lot of time. And is there something? Do you know something to some initiatives to make the business think otherwise?
Good questions, thank you. To start with your last one thing that I don't know anything about is the Russian context. So it's really hard for me to say anything about it, but what I'm assuming is that I can imagine that it's harder in certain countries to actually change this. Like I have worked a lot in the Netherlands, I've worked a lot in Sweden, I've worked a lot in countries where there might already be a certain buy-in to that. So yes, I can imagine that there are certain countries where it's harder to actually do that. But then I would come back to the same argument, is that it's about learning to speak the language of, in this case, the businesses. And I said, if it's more about money, then yes, there is there's a lot of research done by a professor called Bob Willard, and he writes around like the business case of sustainability, and he shows how organizations can actually make more money by moving towards sustainability in different steps. So this could be related to just simply reducing like energy and energy consumption, saving waste, etc. Those are the small incremental steps. But it's also about how they become ahead of the game and they start to influence their supply chain. And so there is a lot of research around that. But as I said, I don't know enough about the Russian context to actually say something about that. And then in terms of yes, I agree that 12 years is a really limited piece of time, and systems change, and that's actually what we're going to do after the break, is actually look a little bit more on how those living systems change, and that takes time. So again, I personally don't think that supplementary education is enough, but I also don't think that we can change these educational systems in 3 years or something like that, right? That just takes time. If you look at an example like, I don't know what it's like in Russia, but in Europe or in the Netherlands, smoking, and how our mindset around smoking in public has changed over the years, that took time. Like it went gradually and then slowly people started prohibiting it and then slowly change happened. But there is this notion, I don't know if you're familiar with the tipping points and the social tipping points. It's done by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about how there is like a critical mass where if you reach that certain mass, and I don't know exactly what percentage he argues for, but he argues that if you can create change in this specific type of the population, then you reach a tipping point where change will happen faster. So I think that would be my initial answer. Is that enough? Yes. Yep. Yeah, sure.
Да, спасибо. Я на русском языке задам вопрос. Скажите, вы сказали, что и с этим нельзя не согласиться, что сложно сразу изменить всю образовательную систему. Это безусловно. Но если говорить конкретно про Швецию, вот в Швеции готовили экономистов, например. Вот что конкретно в Швеции было сделано для того, чтобы готовить как-то по-другому экономистов, например? То есть какие-то новые дисциплины были вот, с учетом принципов устойчивого развития. То есть конкретно первый и второй шаг, что было сделано именно вот в Швеции, в этой стране.
Alright, so if I understand you correctly, it's about what Sweden did in training economists and in terms of sustainable development. Is that correct?
Нет. Как вы начали по-другому учить экономистов, например, чтобы в них лучше зашло вот это контекст устойчивого развития?
Alright, so one thing that we did, or the one thing that we do in terms of looking at the economy, and like I don't have something to draw on, but what you normally see in terms of sustainability is actually something called the triple bottom line, right? You look at like the ecological aspect, the economical aspect, and the social aspect, and there's something in the middle, and that's what we think about in terms of sustainability. But that's assuming that the economic system is as important as our ecological system and our social system. I would argue that that's not true, because without an ecological system, there is no such thing as an economical system, because the economy is completely depending on our planet. Like everything the economy creates is depending on the planet. So we take a different approach, which is called a nested system approach, where you have the ecological piece, which is the planet, then there's the social piece inside of that, and then there's the economical piece inside of that. So that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the role of economics in terms of sustainability.
Я предполагала услышать более конкретный вопрос, но в принципе мы ответ точнее более конкретный. Ну, может быть, это сложно. Вы написали новый учебник? Ну, так скажу. Вы придумали новую дисциплину. Вот как вы переформатировали магистратуры, бакалавриаты, сделали вот профподготовку, вопрос был у коллеги. То есть нужно, например, чиновников всех пропустить через доп. Образование, либо топ-менеджеров через доп. Образование. Лайфхак нам нужен.
Лайфхак.
Мы, в принципе, знаем про вот эти все, да, 3 единства, это все уже зашло. А вот Петр спрашивал, да, мы хотим конкретные кейсы, практические. Дайте нам учебники, дайте нам методичку. Нам нужно всех учителей как-то пропустить через новую, да, парадигму вот эту. Спасибо. Извините.
Спасибо.
Я поясню, я часто представляю органы власти, Государственную Думу, правительство, то есть у меня вопрос такой, потому что очень часто требуют от правительства изменить систему образования. А что нужно сделать, никто не говорит. С чего начать?
All right, cool. So you want more practical example, how can we actually do it? I can't give you that specific answer. I can only tell you what we've been doing in our program. I can't really tell you about how it happens in general in Sweden. And if I look at how we look at economy in our program and how we actually teach it, is that higher level piece. It is this systems perspective and understanding how that works, because we want to train our people to see the whole system and actually create an understanding what the role of the economic system is in that. So one thing we really talk a lot about in our economic system is the role of money, and actually having people understand how money is created and how that relates to a lot of the unsustainable outcomes that we have. So a lot of the money that is created in the world is actually created by private banks. They can create it out of nothing by just opening up a new account and having a debt-based interest, right? If you buy a house, there's a 150,000 euros just created out of nothing, and it just comes from the bank. They do it like this digitally, and it's there. But there's also this piece of interest that they take over it. So that means that every single time there is a need for more money in the world to actually solve all of these interest problems. So then you get this notion where you need to have infinite growth on a finite planet. So what we do with our students is we talk a lot about how the money system works, and then we have a conversation around that. I'm sorry, I can't make it more specific. That's what we do. So we don't really focus on the specific. I think 2 more questions and then we take a little break, because I actually want to play around and have everybody standing up a little bit, because it feels like I've been talking a lot and I've just been saying like, I don't want to talk so much. So yes.
You said that in order to address global issues, you need to learn to see the big picture. I agree with that. But at the same time, issues like global warming are so huge that it's almost impossible for an ordinary human mind to keep the whole picture. And so we have nothing to do but to separate it in like little pieces, maybe learn to see how they are interconnected, but still it's like this separation. So can you tell a bit more about this balance between seeing the whole picture but at the same time separate?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, as a human being, it is impossible for me, for you, for anybody to see the whole picture. We all have our limited way of looking, which is always somewhat constrained by any type of boundaries. And the thing that I would argue is what you then need to do is to invite the system in the room. So you need to make sure that if you're addressing a challenge, that you're inviting all the different perspectives. It's a little bit like the elephant, that you invite all of those pieces, whether that is government, industry, like you invite them all in the table because they all have their own valuable perspective of the system. And the idea is that if you actually have a representative of the whole system in the room, the solutions that you will create are on a more like on a systemic level instead of just these specific mindsets. So a lot of the work that we do outside of this program is our long-term multi-stakeholder processes where you invite loads of different stakeholders in different moments and you design certain processes for them to work together. So I think that would be my answer of like, yes, it is limited in the way we look at it. And I would say one of the ways to address this is to actually think about who you invite in the room in different types of collaboration processes. Yep. One more and then we have a 5-minute break and then I would love for you to come back to play around a little bit. Yes?
I just want to help you in a way to answer.
Yes, please. Thank you. And I can have some butter.
I will make a move. So the thing is, I was studying in Sweden in Lund, and I took some training course. I was also in the summer school at PTH.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
oh, cool.
we studied this natural step methodology.
Yes. Yeah.
And right now I'm coming to the conclusion that what we face in Russia is about the more passionate people who can, as you, in my opinion, you said very right, talk to people in the right language and who can share their passion, their interest. Because, like, we have this example when it's like you provide this example of like Arab Spring, etc. But like in Russia, in 1970s, there were like small parties that was like very tiny. It was not considered to be the strong one. At some point they took over. It was only about 4% of the population who were following them. It was a communist party. So I mean this, it's about the passion and how you provide this passion to people. I would agree it's not only about this writing the textbooks, it's around the cases, about the specific like sharing passion, you know, be providing interesting solutions. Not like teaching, because teaching of instruments is good for you know, for regulation, for environmental regulation. That's what we need. Like, but passionate people who change the system. So it's my.
No, I really like that, and I would really agree with that. Like, there is multiple examples in history where a few people just changed history by all of their actions. There's this really beautiful example that in the early 1900s, in England, the women's suffragettes were the first one actually standing up for women's rights. They did that in a non-violent way, but they had no clue that Mahatma Gandhi was actually in England at that moment, and he got inspired by what he saw, and it was the basis of his movement in India, which then again influenced Martin Luther King because he was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. And then that inspired loads of other people. So like the single actions of some small people in here that don't even know that they have these huge ripple effects is what you often see in history, where a lot of our actions and the consequences and the results of that actually go across generations. So yes, I would totally agree that it's all about people. So
It wasn't a question, but
yes, fair enough, yes.
can we call it non-formal education, and how to evaluate this type of education?
That's a really good question, because I don't really believe in evaluating through numbers or course surveys or whatever. For me, I would say the way to evaluate is to ask these students what they thought of this experience. And Anastasia, who is Okan's fiancée, I would almost say, She was one of the, if you see her, ask her what she thinks of the program. And I think if you look at a lot of our alumni of this program, they say that it changed their life. Like I can speak to that as an alumni of the program as well. Like it changed my life because it gave me a different language and a different way of looking at the world and a different way of interacting with people. So I would say that, but I think one of the main issues that we have is it's really hard to evaluate in complex issues, because often what you also see is that if you want to, let's say, do this whole thing around, yes, we're going to invite the system in the room and have conversations, a lot of the decision makers will say, sure, what are you going to do? How much money is it going to generate? And you don't know, because it's complexity and nobody can predict it. So there's a big tension between actually getting funding for these processes, because you can never say, I'm going to bring all these people and organizations in the room, and this is exactly the result that we're having, and this is exactly the change that we're creating. And that's a big tension in the room. And I had a thesis team last year that I was supervising, and they focused a lot around this notion of evaluation in complexity. And then it becomes way more about the intangible part. So there's this distinction between the tangible piece, and these are all the projects and stuff, but that's really hard to predict. But there is an intangible piece about more knowledge, better relationships, more trust in the system. These are more intangible pieces, but by actually focusing on them, like these tangible results will come, but you never know what they actually are. So, good question. I don't have a specific answer, but in my specific context, I would evaluate by asking these students what they thought of this program. So,
Do they have some projects in the end?
yes, you mean in this program? Yeah, no, we actually, like, our students now are starting to work as consultants for different organizations. So we have student teams working with different organizations, and they actually guide them towards sustainability. So we have them working in a team of 5, and they are consultants. And the thing is, because our students are such a different age range, lots of them have loads of experience as well. And often what we see is that these organizations are really grateful because they actually get like free consultancy. And we work with a certain framework around sustainable development that has a scientific foundation, and there's a whole process around it. So often it is seen as something that is really valuable as well, to actually create these types of collaborations already inside the program. So, do we need a break, or is like a leg stretch enough? Yes? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and then we do a quick thing here.